Freddie Mercury couldn't speak, but when his nurse sang, he sang back. November 18th, 1991, Garden Lodge, London. Helen Morrison was the only person in the world who heard Freddie Mercury's final song. Not at Live Aid, not at Wembley Stadium, not in a recording studio surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment. Freddie's last performance happened at 3 in the morning in his bedroom, 6 days before he died, sung to a 62-year-old night nurse who'd never even been a Queen fan. Here's what made it extraordinary. Freddie had no voice left. AIDS had destroyed his vocal cords. He couldn't speak a single word. But when Helen began nervously humming Love of My Life, trying anything to ease his suffering, Freddie's eyes filled with tears of recognition. His lips started moving, forming every lyric silently but perfectly. He was singing with her. No sound, but unmistakable music. And Helen realized she was witnessing something precious, proof that music doesn't need sound to exist, that songs live in the heart even when the voice dies. Helen Morrison had been a palliative care nurse for 18 years by November 1991. She had sat with hundreds of dying patients, held countless hands through final breaths, and developed the kind of professional composure that allowed her to provide comfort without becoming emotionally destroyed by the constant presence of death. She was hired to care for Freddie Mercury through a private nursing agency that specialized in discreet end-of-life care for high-profile clients. The agency had been very clear about the assignment: absolute confidentiality, professional boundaries at all times, no discussion of the patient's identity or condition with anyone outside the immediate care team. Helen had agreed to all the terms without fully understanding who she would be caring for. When she arrived at Garden Lodge for her first shift on November 12, 1991, and was introduced to Freddie Mercury, she experienced a moment of recognition followed immediately by profound sadness. Even someone who didn't follow rock music knew who Freddie Mercury was, the flamboyant frontman of Queen, one of the most distinctive voices in music history. And now that voice was gone, stolen by a disease that was killing him slowly and cruelly. Freddie's condition in mid-November was devastating. He weighed less than 100 pounds, his body wasted by the relentless progression of AIDS-related complications. He could barely walk without assistance, spent most of his time in bed, and had lost the ability to speak clearly more than a few days earlier. The virus had attacked his vocal cords and throat, making even whispers painful and eventually impossible. Helen's job was to manage his pain medication, monitor his vital signs, help with basic hygiene and comfort measures, and most importantly, ensure he wasn't alone during the long, dark hours between midnight and 8 in the morning when the day staff arrived. Jim Hutton, Freddie's partner, would usually sit with him until exhaustion forced him to sleep. Then Helen would take over the vigil. The first few nights were professionally routine. Helen administered medications on schedule, adjusted pillows, monitored breathing, and maintained the quiet, calm presence that dying patients often found comforting. Freddie seemed to appreciate her gentle efficiency. He couldn't speak, but his eyes would track her movements around the room, and occasionally he would reach out a skeletal hand to touch her arm in what she interpreted as gratitude. But on her fourth night, November 16th, Jim Hutton made a suggestion that Helen initially rejected completely. "He loves music," Jim said quietly, as he prepared to go to bed around 1 in the morning. "If he gets restless or seems uncomfortable, try singing to him. Anything. He just loves hearing people sing." Helen had looked at Jim with professional skepticism. "Mr. Hutton, I'm a nurse, not a performer. I provide medical care, not entertainment." Jim had smiled sadly. "Freddie isn't looking for entertainment, Helen. He's looking for connection. Music is how he's always connected with people. Now that he can't make music himself, he needs other people to make it for him." "I wouldn't know what to sing," Helen protested. "I'm not familiar with Queen's music. I listen to classical, Bach, Handel, that sort of thing." "Sing him Bach then," Jim replied. "Sing him anything. Just let him hear a human voice making something beautiful. That's what matters to him." Helen had nodded politely but had no intention of actually singing. It felt inappropriate, unprofessional, and frankly embarrassing. She was there to provide medical care, not to perform amateur concerts for a dying rock star. But November 18th changed everything. Freddie had been particularly restless that evening. His breathing was labored, and he kept shifting position in bed as if trying to escape discomfort that had no physical location. Helen had administered his scheduled pain medication, but it didn't seem to help. She tried adjusting his pillows, changing the room temperature, dimming the lights further. Nothing worked. Freddie's eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that mixed physical pain with something deeper, a kind of existential distress that medication couldn't touch. At 3 in the morning, Helen found herself at a loss. She had exhausted all her professional interventions. Freddie was suffering, but not in a way that nursing training had prepared her to address. She sat in the chair beside his bed, holding his skeletal hand, watching him struggle, and feeling utterly helpless. That's when she remembered Jim's suggestion about music, and that's when a melody started running through her head. Love of My Life, a Queen song she'd heard on the radio a few weeks earlier while driving to work. She hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but apparently her brain had absorbed the tune anyway. Helen hesitated. This felt ridiculous. She wasn't a singer. She didn't even like rock music particularly. But Freddie was suffering, and she had nothing else to offer, so she began humming. Quietly, almost under her breath, she hummed the melody of Love of My Life. She didn't know all the words, so she just hummed, letting the tune fill the silent room. The effect on Freddie was immediate and profound. His restless movement stopped. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and deepen. And most remarkably, his eyes, which had been staring unfocused at the ceiling, turned to look directly at Helen with an intensity that was almost shocking coming from someone so physically diminished. Helen stopped humming, startled by the sudden focus in Freddie's gaze. But the moment she stopped, Freddie's hand tightened on hers with surprising strength, and his mouth opened as if trying to form words that his damaged vocal cords couldn't produce. "You want me to keep singing?" Helen asked quietly. Freddie's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, just barely, but unmistakably. Helen took a breath and started again, this time actually singing the words she could remember. Her voice was untrained and uncertain, nothing like the polished performances Freddie had spent his life creating. But she sang anyway, because a dying man needed music more than he needed perfect technique. "Love of my life, you've hurt me, you've broken my heart, and now you leave me." As Helen sang those words, something extraordinary happened. Freddie's lips began moving, forming the words silently along with her. No sound came out. His voice was gone, destroyed by disease and time. But the words were there, perfectly synchronized with Helen's singing, his mouth shaping every syllable even though no air passed through his damaged vocal cords. Helen's own voice wavered as she realized what was happening. Freddie Mercury was singing with her. Voicelessly, soundlessly, but unmistakably singing, his lips forming lyrics he had written decades earlier, lyrics that had meant something profound to him then, and apparently still meant something profound now as he lay dying. Tears began streaming down Helen's face, but she kept singing. "Love of my life, can't you see? Bring it back, don't take it away from me." Freddie's eyes never left hers. His lips continued moving, forming every word. And in his eyes, Helen saw something she had never quite seen in a dying patient before. Not resignation, not even peace exactly, but a kind of transcendent connection, as if the act of silently singing was allowing him to access some part of himself that illness couldn't destroy. When Helen reached the end of the verse and didn't know the words anymore, she hummed the melody instead. Freddie's lips stopped moving, but his hand remained tight around hers, and his breathing had become calm and regular for the first time all night. "Would you like me to sing something else?" Helen whispered. Freddie nodded again, the tears in his eyes now flowing freely down his hollowed cheeks. Helen began singing the only other Queen song she could remember any words to, Bohemian Rhapsody, or at least the opening. "Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy?" Again, Freddie's lips moved, forming the words soundlessly. His eyes closed, but his mouth continued shaping lyrics, his face showing the kind of peace that morphine had failed to provide. For the next 4 hours, from 3 in the morning until 7, when Jim Hutton woke and came to relieve her, Helen Morrison sat beside Freddie Mercury's bed and sang. She sang every Queen song she could remember fragments of. She sang classical pieces she knew from her own musical education as a child. She sang hymns and folk songs and half-forgotten lullabies her mother had sung to her decades ago. And through it all, when the songs were ones Freddie knew, his lips moved wordlessly along. When they were songs unfamiliar to him, he simply listened with his eyes closed and his breathing calm, his hand holding Helen's as if her voice was the only thing anchoring him to life. When Jim came into the room at 7 that morning, he found Helen still singing quietly and Freddie sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Jim's eyes filled with tears as he realized what had happened. "Thank you," he whispered to Helen. "Thank you for giving him music when he couldn't make it himself." Helen could barely speak around the emotion constricting her throat. "He sang with me. He couldn't make sound, but he sang every word. I've never seen anything like it." Jim nodded, wiping his eyes. "Music isn't about sound for Freddie. It never was. It's about connection. You connected with him tonight in the way he understands best. You gave him what he needed most." Freddie Mercury died 3 days later, on November 24, 1991. Helen wasn't on duty that night. It was her scheduled day off. But Jim called her the next morning to tell her that Freddie had passed peacefully in his sleep with Jim and a few close friends beside him. "He was calm at the end," Jim told her, "like he'd been since that night you sang to him. Whatever you gave him, it carried him through his final days." Helen attended Freddie's private funeral service, standing quietly in the back, still maintaining the professional distance she'd been trained to keep. But as the service ended and people began filing out, Jim Hutton approached her. "Freddie would want you to know something," Jim said quietly. "That last night, when you sang to him, after you left, he managed to whisper a few words to me. The last words he spoke before he lost his voice completely. He said, 'She understands. Music is the soul singing. Body doesn't matter.'" Helen broke down crying, all her professional composure finally crumbling. "I didn't even like Queen before I met him. I didn't understand what his music meant to people." "You understood what mattered," Jim replied gently. "You understood that music isn't about performance or perfection. It's about connection between souls. That's why Freddie could still sing even when his voice was gone. The song was never in his vocal cords. It was in his spirit." For 30 years, Helen Morrison kept that night confidential. She never told reporters, never sold her story to tabloids, never violated the trust that had been placed in her as Freddie's caregiver. She continued working as a palliative care nurse, but something fundamental had changed in how she approached dying patients. She began singing to them. Not every patient. Some people didn't want music. But the ones who seemed restless or afraid or unreachable through conventional comfort measures, she would sing to them quietly. Hymns, folk songs, classical pieces, even rock songs if that's what the patient loved. And she found that music reached people in ways that medicine couldn't. In 2021, at age 72, Helen Morrison retired from nursing. Shortly after, she agreed to participate in a BBC documentary about Freddie Mercury's final days. It was the first time she had ever publicly discussed what happened that November night in 1991. "I was trained to believe that professional nursing meant maintaining emotional distance," Helen explained to the documentary filmmaker. "But Freddie taught me that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is abandon protocol and simply be human with another human being. He was dying. He couldn't speak. But when I sang to him, he sang back, voicelessly, soundlessly, but absolutely singing. And I realized that music isn't about vocal cords or technical ability. Music is the soul expressing itself. Bodies fail, voices die, but songs are eternal." The documentary showed Helen now working as a volunteer in hospice facilities, singing to dying patients just as she had sung to Freddie Mercury 3 decades earlier. She had developed a whole philosophy of end-of-life music therapy based on that one night. "I tell families that the last sense to leave a dying person is hearing," Helen explained. "Your loved one might not be able to talk anymore, might not be able to open their eyes or squeeze your hand, but they can still hear you. And if you sing to them, even if you're not a good singer, even if you don't know all the words, you're giving them something medicine can't provide. You're giving them connection. You're reminding them that they're not alone." The documentary included footage of Helen singing "Love of My Life" to a dying patient, her aged voice still untrained but filled with compassion. The patient's lips moved silently, just as Freddie's had, forming words to a song they remembered even as their body failed. Freddie Mercury couldn't speak during his final days, Helen said to the camera, tears in her eyes. But he could still sing, because singing isn't about sound, it's about the human spirit expressing joy, pain, love, loss, all the things that make us who we are. That night in November 1991, I learned that lesson from the greatest singer in rock history, and I've spent the last 30 years sharing what he taught me. The documentary ended with Helen standing in the Garden Lodge Memorial Garden, looking at the wall where fans still leave flowers and tributes. She placed a single rose among the others and sang softly, "Love of My Life," the song that had connected her to a dying stranger and taught her that music is the soul made audible. Today, Helen Morrison's approach to end-of-life singing is taught in palliative care programs around the world. Her memoir, The Nurse Who Sang Back, has become required reading for hospice workers, and thousands of dying patients have experienced the comfort of being sung to by caregivers who learned from Helen that sometimes the most powerful medicine has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals and everything to do with simple human connection through music. Freddie Mercury lost his voice in November 1991, but through one compassionate nurse who overcame her professional reservations to sing to a suffering patient, Freddie's understanding of music as spiritual connection rather than physical performance has echoed forward, bringing comfort to countless people in their final moments. The lesson is simple but profound. Singing isn't about having a beautiful voice or perfect technique. Singing is about the soul expressing itself, about connection between human beings, about beauty that transcends the limitations of failing bodies. And sometimes, the most important song you'll ever sing is the one you sing to someone who can no longer sing back, except silently, with lips that form words the heart still remembers even when the voice is gone.